I think, honestly, I want to talk about this topic with colorism. People often act like, with the dynamic of colorism, I feel like people who struggle with it usually are people who did not fit the dynamic. Okay, so I think, at least, okay, I come from a family where this situation occurs, but everybody goes along with the dynamic basically. And so when they fall in line with that dynamic, they end up basically not really even noticing the dynamic. And even if they did notice it, they wouldn't care because their interest falls within the dynamic. So, when people talk about, I was watching a video with colorism, and somebody was talking about how, um, they were talking about how black men don't prefer dark skinned to brown skinned women, um, and how these women are complaining about colorism. Well, I think most of the time, this issue, for me, in my experience, it always seems like it's a dark skinned black woman who wants a dark skinned black man. And to me, I think this perspective is kind of common for black women, and I do think it's because they didn't fall into the dynamic. Like, for example, in my experience, I've always noticed in my family, the females are most of the time with men who are lighter skinned or light skinned, and the men are with women that are light skinned. Now, the thing is, I don't really have many dark skinned black family members that are male. I have one, but the whole problem with that whole situation was, my darkest family members aren't my full aunts and uncles. Those are people from a different father because my grandmother, for some reason, has genes that I think are active with other men, but with him, she has lighter children. Now, her children aren't light skinned. They're not even brown skinned to my idea of what brown skinned is. I consider myself brown skinned, but my aunts and uncles are about, most of them are about my mother's color range, like Gabrielle Union, um, maybe a Kiki Palmer, but a Kiki Palmer at her darker skin tone. Because sometimes Kiki Palmer can look very, very peanut butter like. I'm saying when she's darker, basically. But like a Gabrielle Union, like a Kelly Rowland type of skin tone, basically. People like to call that brown skin sometimes, but I consider it dark skinned. Um, but what I'm trying to say here is that many of the time, from what I've seen, is that people will try to say that dark skinned black men don't prefer dark skinned black women. But many of the time, I think many dark skinned black women may not even prefer dark skinned black men. So I never really get why people always complain about this. Because from what I've seen in my family, it's often the dark skinned black women don't prefer dark skinned black men. Like, they're not attracted to them. Another thing, I mean, like, when people say that colorism exists and all that stuff, I don't think it exists because when people say that dark skinned black men are colorists or something, it's never going to be in favor of a light skinned black woman. So, how is it really color? When in reality, it only benefits white women. If it benefits white women, then it's obviously not a color issue, it's a race issue. And if it's a race issue, then why do you think that it's just based off of women? And why are you internalizing it? I don't get that. A man who is, for example, races against himself and his own image, he's just self hating. And if he's self hating, then it's not really colorism, is it? Because it's all about an issue with his own blackness, you know. And, I was watching a video actually from O'Shea Dick Jackson talking about this with black men, who constantly obsess over like women who were like non-black, like Kanye West, for example. His obsession with women like um Kim Kardashian, and constantly looking for women who look like Kim Kardashian. And it's like, if you paid attention to what he said in the past, you could see that he was specifically saying that he chose a woman who had no black in her, specifically because he wanted children that were what he would consider beautiful, which basically implies he thinks that he's very ugly, you know, which I wouldn't disagree with. But he thinks he's very ugly and he would have children that are very ugly. I never understand why people like that, when they make a statement like that, why does it bother anyone who is a dark skinned black woman, a black woman, a light skinned black woman, mixed black woman, or whatever? Because I remember when he said that comment, it seemed like everybody was upset because he chose a white woman or a non black woman. Kim Kardashian is of Middle Eastern descent. I consider that white, but that's a long argument that I'm not really willing to do in this video. Um, so, he chose a woman who wasn't black over a woman who was mixed race. And, so a lot of people had an issue with that or whatever. Um, my point is, I don't think that's a color issue, obviously. It's the issue of I don't like my blackness. I think my blackness is ugly. You know, I don't want to see children that look like me. And to me, in my opinion, I mean, like, if you look at him, I mean, like, do you want to see a little Kanye? I wouldn't. I was hoping each time Kim was having children that they would come out looking like her. But my point is, I don't really see that as colorism, obviously. I don't consider it colorist. It's an issue of that person hating themselves and having a self hate issue. Um, so that's my perspective on that. But I mean, like, I think that outside of that whole situation of when people are talking about colorists, supposed colorist men who are just self hating, you know, I really actually think that their main issue is within the dynamic of people who actually just prefer people who are lighter or darker, and they're not, there's no self hate there or anything of that nature. I think it's normal people are attracted to a bit of their opposites, so that's not really a shock that someone would prefer lighter or someone would prefer darker, you know. I think their issue is they don't fall into that dynamic in the black community where many people who are lighter skinned will prefer darker and many people who are darker prefer lighter. So when that happens, they cry colorism. But the reality is they just didn't fall into the dynamic. And I think this is a major part because my mother would say that many of the time she didn't get much attention from dark skinned black men. And she was very happy about this because my mother falls into the dynamic. She prefers lighter skinned men. She prefers light skinned men. I she's said in the past that she's never had any she's never had any interest or dated a man who was at all dark skinned or close to dark skinned for that matter. It's always been men who are on the lighter spectrum of the spectrum, basically. Um, so, I mean, women like that would not cry about colorism because they are totally fine in their situation. They fit into the dynamic, just like black men who have their mindset fit into their dynamic. I honestly don't have anything against this. I think that, that's totally normal as long as it is not in the sense of the lighter the better. If it's the lighter the better, that is an idea of white is better. But if it's just you prefer lighter skin, that's different, you know. But I do relate a lot to those dark skinned women who basically, are attracted to dark skinned men and do not fall into that dynamic. So then they are not preferred by their. Because personally, as someone who falls on the lighter end of the spectrum, I've always preferred lighter men, and that's always been a problem to me. So for me, it was just always easier to prefer, I guess you could say, the light test because there's more of a spectrum between, like a very fair skinned white guy is more of a difference than someone who is Hispanic. Many Hispanics are the same color as me. So there's no dynamic difference. Um, mixed race people and, people who are like triracial Hispanics and stuff like that. I'm attracted to many of those types of people, but there is no dynamic difference. You know what I mean? So a lot of people who are attracted to what's different from them are attracted to different people who fit that spectrum, basically. So I definitely relate to those women, but there's no reason to really bash or attack people for fitting into a dynamic that works for most black people. That's nothing against dark skinned black women. I don't think dark skinned black women lose in this dynamic because there's a lot of lighter skinned men who actually prefer them. It's just that those women who don't prefer lighter skinned men are the ones upset, basically, because they get left out in the cold because they don't prefer what prefers them. You know, and I could understand that too, because I've had many of the time dark skinned black men who would prefer me, but I don't prefer them. I don't make it about colorism though.